Hi, and welcome to Deep Talks with SER. This is our first presentation on the history of Neopaganism. You can't talk about Neopaganism without talking about Gerald Gardner, often referred to as the father of modern Neopaganism. The lore behind him says that he was part of an old witch cult that lasted through thousands of years, through the Christianization of England, etc. However, that's not necessarily true. Reality is a bit more complicated than that. You had several factors going into the creation of what will become Wicca. On the one hand, you have the interest in Romanticism in the 19th century, which led to a lot of preservation of lore, cultural history, a rise in interest in classical myths and legends of ancient Rome, etc. On the one hand, that was a good thing because a lot of myths that might have been lost were preserved and a lot of folklore was safely guarded. But on the other hand, you had a rise in nationalism and then these jerks, so kind of a mixed blessing. On the other side of things, you had a rise in interest in Hermeticism and the Kabbalah, both forms of mysticism, and that led to the founding of several secret societies, including the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. These secret societies were not strictly religious, but not strictly non-religious, and their history is very complicated, and I can't go into all of it here, but definitely worth checking out. Added into this, the 1800s love of spiritualism, interest in mediumship and ghosts and that kind of thing, and all these things feeding off each other and growing off of each other. And that led to the creation of the New Forest Coven in the 20s and 30s, and then Gerald Gardner. Another person worth talking about here is Aleister Crowley. He was part of the Order Templar Orientis, which is a spin-off of the Order of the Golden Dawn. If Gardner is the father of modern paganism, then Crowley is the creepy uncle of modern paganism. Crowley gave us a lot of modern neo-pagan things. One of his big ideas was the law of magic, that being do as thou will, which would eventually become do as thou will and it harm none, the Wiccan Rede. Also, he codified a lot of the Hermetic rituals, which we see today in a lot of neo-pagan rituals. Many of them had similar elements, the calling of the quarters, the male-female archetypes, etc. He also had a lot of the Dionysian rituals and mindset, the emphasis on ecstasy and emotion as a way to spiritual enlightenment. In the 30s, he gave fragments of the Odio rituals to Gerald Gardner, who filled in some of the gaps with folklore and neo-druidry, and made it an actual religion that a person could enter, an initiatory tradition as opposed to a secret society. He also made Neopaganism public. Where Crowley loved the limelight but loved anything that gave him attention, Gardner liked to be reasonably realistic and reasonably accurate. He loved the limelight, but he also loved to make it something accurate and believable, as opposed to something radical and crazy. A third person that needs to be mentioned here is Doreen Valiente. One of Gardner's priestesses, she took him aside at one point and said, "So, you know Crowley's crazy, right?" He was all saying, "Yeah, kind of." So she took a lot of his rituals, filtered out some of Crowley's crazy, and what was left was essentially the modern neo-pagan ritual. In the 60s, with Wicca being more publicly noticeable, forms of reconstructionism of older religions came into the public eye. One of these was Druidry and Celtic Reconstructionism, which, while separate groups and separate traditions, are often intermingled. Druidry felt that Wicca was too disorganized and too influenced by Crowley and other forms of Hermeticism, and so they focused on more scholarly accuracy and more historical accuracy, trying to construct something that was closer to what was actually practiced in olden times. Isaac Bonwitz was an important part of this, taking Druidry from a school club to an actual religious movement. At about the same time, you had Asatru and Odinism forming in Iceland, and similar cults forming across most of Northern Europe. These were organized around the worship of the Norse gods in a folkish and very kin-based group, focusing on more building communities than building necessarily large religions. A man named Sveinbjorn and his glorious beard were responsible for making this an official religion with the Icelandic government. In the 60s, Neopaganism made its way across the pond to America. It came about the same time as the countercultural movement and found a good home here. Both Wicca, Neopaganism, and the countercultural movement were all share the same ideas of being very female empowering, being very environmentally conscious, being very focused on ideals of peace as opposed to war, and being very queer friendly. This allowed them to grow and flourish in the rising movements of counterculturalism. As time went on, a lot of Wiccans split into different groups. In England, you had Gardnerian traditions that would grow into Alexandrian traditions, most of which were highly initiatory and highly exclusive. In America, because of the countercultural movements, many forms of Wicca were based on countercultural movements or important social themes. You had Dianic Wiccans who were primarily focused on women and women's rights. The Radical Fairies, which was a Wiccan tradition focused on gay men, and then Fairy Wicca, which was mostly focused on the worship of nature spirits, fairies, sprites, brownies, that kind of thing. With all these traditions moving around, eventually people stopped being focused on Wicca as a singular movement and created the idea of eclectic paganism. Eclectic paganism stressed the idea that specific religion wasn't important, but a specific practice was, and was built more around the ideas of a singular movement as opposed to a singular religious tradition. In the 70s, Neo-Druidry and Celtic Reconstructionism became popular and made a lot of eclectic paganism much more Celtic focused, giving a lot of the artwork and the traditions much more of a Northern European and British flair. In the 80s, a New Age movement allowed for a rise in interest in New Age practices. Orientalist ideas, crystal readings, faith healing, etc., all became incorporated into eclectic paganism. Other traditions also flourished in America, one of them being the Azuara Society in the 70s. This tradition was focused on Egypt and African Americans and has stayed mostly local to New York and the Harlem scene. You also have Baltic Neopaganism, also called Remuva, which actually started in the early parts of the 1900s, but was suppressed by the Soviets until the 1990s. You also had Greek and Roman Neopaganism starting in Greece and Italy, naturally, in the 90s and picking up a lot of steam. There are, of course, many other traditions, but going over all of them here would take a long time, and because of how Neopaganism is always ever growing and it keeps shifting, it's hard to document what's actually important and what's going to be a big movement at any given point. In the last 2 decades, the internet has allowed for a lot of growth of new religious movements. All of this is happening all over again, but this time at internet speeds. Because of the use of forums, chat rooms, etc., Neopagans could connect to each other instantly from across the world, being able to share and grow in their ideas without having to actually meet. Sites like Witchbox, Wild Hunt, and the Internet Sacred Text Archive allowed for Neopagans to meet, share ideas, find out what's happening in the community, and share important documents without having to actually meet in person. The use of ebooks and digital downloads meant that information could be shared rapidly and efficiently without having to meet in public and without having to have bookstores that cater specifically to Neopagans. Also, the use of cyberspaces like Second Life and other places meant that Neopagan rituals could happen in entirely digital environments without people having to travel long distances just to meet with other co-religionists. As you can see, Neopaganism is a complex history, with a lot of it still growing and still being discovered. So the question is, what's next for Neopaganism? I'm guessing that pagan studies will happen more in colleges. Pop culture paganism will rise to power, for better or for worse. Increased movements towards legal recognition will allow for pagans to exist more prominently in the military and in other places. Also, now that Neopagan movements are gaining speed and gaining size, people will start being able to acquire land and building actual temples as opposed to meeting out of rented spaces or living rooms. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. This talk is brought to you by the Ball State Society for Earth-Based Religions. If you liked it, follow us on Twitter and Facebook for more information and for further videos.